Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Noor Cultural Center. For anybody who might not know me, I'm Samira Kanji, I'm the president here, and so I welcome you to Noor, and as I welcome you to Noor, I also remind myself and everybody else that the land on which we stand has been the home of the indigenous peoples of this country, of this land, for many, many thousands of years. And so it's and remembers that we need to do in order as one small step towards reconciliation. Welcome to our special program today, hosting it for York University's Community Conversation Series. We're delighted to be doing this thing with and for York. For those who don't know, Noor Culture Center has had a very long-standing relationship with York for 12 years, from 2003 to 2015. We had a York Noor Scholar, we had a Noor Fellowship, and then a York Noor Chair, a term chair, which brought scholarship to the university for Islamic studies and made that scholarship available both at the university end and the community end, which was quite a unique collaboration that I think still stands out as a particularly desirable form of collaboration, a corridor of information between the so-called ivory tower and the community. And today's event with York, with their community conversation series, is something in that mold. So I'm delighted to be doing this thing with York, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Narda Razak, who is I wrote it down, I have my piece of paper, associate dean for global and community engagement or something of that sort. So Narda is going to take us into the rest of the evening. So welcome, enjoy the refreshments and enjoy the program. Thank you.
Well, as Samir said, I'm the Associate Dean Global and Community Engagement in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York University. It always is a mouthful to say that. Currently, we're in an agitated state at York because there's a looming strike, and we are hoping that it will be averted because, as many of you may know, that we've had maybe about 2 or 3 strikes in the last 12 to 15 years, and it doesn't bode well for York. And York is such a vibrant space to be in. We have, so many committed to social justice issues, equity, diversity, and all of the other areas. And it's always, it always has a negative impact when these kinds of situations occur. So, activism takes us all kinds of different paths, and this is one of the negative ones that we're hoping will not happen. So thank you, Samira, and all of you at the Noor Cultural Center for hosting the conversation. You have the title here, Mapping Out Muslims in Canada, Critical Debates in Academia and Beyond. As Samira said, York and Noor has had a very special relationship, and it's been many years, but when I joined the faculty, when we merged Artston Atkinson, and I began in 2009, immediately I was sort of involved, and I joined the Noor community through the, personally and also professionally with the chair in Islamic Studies, so that was really a nice intro into this space. So let me turn to the event today. It's a community conversation, an initiative that I began in the fall of 2016. And the premise of it was quite simple, is that I wanted to have faculty members engage with the community and, of course, staff and others. I felt that we always lecture. We have this lecture mode within us that, we take our research and our articles, etc., and we tell it to the audience. And sometimes I feel as if we could have a better way of sharing our research and our ideas together with. So have that conversation. We can throw out some thoughts, ideas, our research, and then have people just converse in different forms, right? So, and I also wanted to provide a space for others to join in, alumni, and I'm seeing, you know, staff who I call alumni as well, with us, who can also partner to share different topics. I have people who are interested in talking about retirement, aging, you know, we have issues around the environment. There's so many ideas. So the conversations really started in the fall of 2016. And about a week ago, we published an ebook with about 16 conversations. I think I sent you the link, so you can have a look at that. So it's just mushroomed and it's flourishing. And this is one conversation that I wanted to have from the beginning. I just thought identity issues around Muslims is just always, you know, always in the news, but what happens to, you know, what happens internally, what happens in terms of identity. I really am hoping that it could lead to a series, because here we are, but I wonder about tween Muslims, I wonder about, you know, teens, I wonder about young women, especially, to have these conversations. I think that it would be a great space to have a couple more with different ideas. So I'm leaving that with you. Last week we had a conversation on the Black Panther, celebrating Blackness in the African diaspora at the Fort York Library, and they had a really great turnout. Well, of course, the movie is, you know, there's a lot of hype, but there's also some critique. And, you know, there was so much participation that they wanted the dialogue to continue. So here we are today at the latest conversation, and I think that this will be a springboard for others. And just a little bit, finally, about the conversations. We have them all over Toronto, in cafes and libraries and museums and so on. And if anyone here would like to host a conversation with a faculty member or with another person in the community, we provide the logistics and we help with the marketing and the promotion of it. So I thank the presenters today. Noor just came to me and we had a great conversation about her interest in hosting a conversation, and she suggested to Noor actually. And here we are. So I thank both of you, Aziza, and I'll turn it over to Khadija.
Thanks, Narda, and assalamu alaikum. I promise I'm the last one to go before we get to our topic. So my job is to introduce you to our speakers. Actually, I have two other jobs, which is slide clicker for Nargis, and also time enforcer, which a job I take very seriously. So each of the speakers will be speaking for 20 minutes, at which point I'll turn off their mics now. We'll be speaking for 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you and conversation, which is what Narda had really wanted to get to. To introduce you to our speakers, first we'll be hearing from Professor Nargis Janafeh. I heard from Joseph that that's how you actually pronounce your last name. So, Professor Nargis Janafeh is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy and Administration, research faculty at the Center for Refugee Studies, and affiliated faculty at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. Her areas of interest are memories of atrocities and injustice and the way they shape the notion of citizenship for marginalized groups, critical studies of human rights, genocide and crimes against humanity, the relationship between nationalism and minority rights in the Balkans and the Middle East, forced migration, and debates on ethics and international law pertaining to mass political violence. She has written journals and books and spoken extensively on all of these issues. So with that, I will hand it over to Professor Nargis.
To be here. So when we had the conversation with Professor Razak, I suggested that somehow I had some views about what's happening in academia and scholarship, and I wanted to know how the community at large would actually relate to some of the debates that are taking place in the academia. So it was a great pleasure to link with Aziza and Adija and Samira, and I'm hoping together and then that's something part of the community participation element. We set the stage for larger, longer, more detailed conversations in the future. So I live with my phone, not for the usual reasons, because I can't carry anything. So this is why some of the slides there are also in my phone. So if I look at some of them here, it is just so that I can actually follow the debate that I've outlined. I put together a PowerPoint of various slides. So the idea is that how do you do a bad PowerPoint and how do you lose people? You basically populate it so much so that no one can listen to you. Everybody looks up there. So please don't do that. The idea is I just wanted to give a sense of some of the key debates that's coming out of scholarship and academia and advocacy, and how they relate to larger debates in the society, but also as someone who has like several hats on, I wanted to highlight what I see as shortcomings in academia and scholarship, and then blind spots, as well as possibilities for future debates. So one of the things that we kind of keep to ourselves, but I think it's really important to underline, is that universities are not just institutions of education, they're actually platforms for politicization. They are indeed a reflection of the society at large. And I am very proud to have one of my students here actually. And what happens in the classroom is indeed a mirror to the society at large. They are knowledge-producing institutions. They disseminate new information. And there are certain structures in place that allows for academics to bring everyday life and social concerns back into the institution, produce detailed knowledge, and then start sharing it with the younger generation, which then almost over time becomes normalized and standardized. And in order to do that, you have to engage in new kinds of research. In order to do that, in the Canadian context, you have to tap into public funding. And so some of these things I'll just briefly highlight in my talk as to where the funding comes from and what themes emerge in Canadian academia for the last 20 years concerning Muslims in Canada, and what kind of results have been produced, and where do they get circulated, who gets to read them, who gets to use them. And then also, hopefully with the help of Aziza, we're going to highlight some of the emptiness or muteness or silences or blind spots that are happening. So I've been working in this field in general in minority rights and marginalized communities for more than 2 decades. And as the community conversation came close, I decided, okay, let me just do a kind of recent canvassing of what's out there. The last time I've done that was about 1.5 years ago, because we were putting together a workshop on Muslim identities in the diaspora. And I came across more than 2,000 items that are actually published that are specifically relating to the situation of Muslims in North America and in particular in Canada. So one of the things that I did for this presentation's purposes is that I just wanted to share with you what I call keyword clusters. That is to say, when you do academic search or when you do document search, there are certain combinations. It's a bit like detective work. I mean, it takes a bit of training in the sense that you really need to zoom in. And these clusters are where the majority of the work published by scholars and advocates are gathered around. So obviously the first item is media representation, misrepresentation, Islam, Islamophobia, discourse analysis, content analysis. But then comes next, very close to it, is the veil issue, the face veil, the hijab, the niqab, the threat. And you do have a whole chunk that is around critical race theory, Islamophobia, Quebec nationalism, identity politics, reasonable accommodation. And then a lot of the debate kind of centers around critical readings of multiculturalism in the Canadian context. And I kind of spent quite a bit of time looking at how did this debate take place in the Canadian context as opposed to European context, because we worked with European colleagues, colleagues from Europe, Many of them are Muslims themselves. And the terms of the debate in the European context are actually quite different. And this is something I wanted to bring to your attention as well for future conversations. Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. However, the composition of Muslim communities in different continents are quite significantly different from each other. So in Europe, you do have labor migration primarily. You do have a very thick working class population that were brought into the country to do unskilled labor. So there's also a class conflict issue as far as Muslims in Europe and the rest of the European population is concerned. In the North American context, in the United States context, there is a predominance of immigration from Middle East, and therefore there's a very significant Arab component. But the Canadian context, when you do the demographics of it, first of all, you don't have labor migration per se. The majority of the Muslims in Canada come through a point system, and the refugee population who are Muslim are a very, very small number. And therefore, you have a fairly high-profile, very educated population. Secondly, ethno-religiously, in terms of the schools of Islam, there's a great variety, and the majority of them are already minorities in the countries that they came from. So they were Muslim minorities where they were. Therefore, they have a very good understanding and awareness of marginalization and minority status. So the composition itself, in a way, determines terms of the debate, or it should really. So this blanket understanding of Muslim diaspora globally, in most cases, leads to misrepresentation and rather shallow analysis. So in the Canadian context, there's only recently emerging understanding of the nuances of the community, divisions within the community, as well as the aspirations of the community. All the same, the background remains is as institutional Islamophobia, but it's important to locate where the agency is. So if we move on to other clusters of keywords, homophobia is another issue that's coming up a lot. And as you're going to see in a minute, there is growing work, scholarly work and advocacy work, that not only starts a conversation about LGBT identities and lesbian identities and critiques of homophobia from within Islam and conversations with the community, but it's almost like this scholarship is also trying to start a conversation about Islam. So some of the writers themselves are practicing Muslims, and so there's this overlap between their own identity and their own lifestyles and what they're trying to deliver in terms of identities within Muslim communities. Then there's this whole business of clash of civilizations, the militarization, the friend-enemy, securitization of borders, citizenship, unmaking, remaking citizenship, political representation, which then leads to the good Muslim, bad Muslim constitution in terms of how they relate to the political establishment at large. There's a whole cluster on law, and a lot of that work relates to administrative detention. And contrary to the sort of stuff that you see in terms of Black Canadians or indigenous Canadians of indigenous background, for instance, there isn't this sizable big Muslim population in Canadian jails. They're not incarcerated. The main debate is often related to immigration, refugee status, and detention. And there's fantastic work. Some of the work is coming through defense lawyers and human rights and immigration lawyers. There's a growing body of work that is using the treatment of suspect Muslims as a point of critique against the whole Canadian citizenship regime. So that's a growing area. Then there's this really troublesome area of work which I try to publish on, but even to talk about is really, really difficult. This counterterrorism, terrorism, policing of the Muslim communities, shortcut measures in terms of appointing informants from within the community so that the teenagers won't be picked up by the fundamentalist movements. Very, very troubling cases, discussions. And there you see kind of and I think Aziza will probably talk about this in particular, the stereotyping of the Muslim communities, in particular the Muslim youth, based on a few examples of extreme involvements is very troubling. And the fear factor, the systemic racism factor, constant surveillance of the communities, this is coming up as well. So I'm not going to go through all of them. If you want, I actually suggested that these are going to be with the center. And I also have a long bibliography I'm preparing for all the academic works and public reports that are on Muslims in Canada that is accessible. I don't know whether there's anyone among you who is writing on these issues, teaching on these issues, or who have children at home, or grandchildren at home who might be interested in these issues. But one of the things that's really important as far as I'm concerned is for the community itself to be aware of these resources, and for these resources to be accessible at large. Because by and large, this is kind of an untapped treasure as far as I'm concerned. And even most of my students at York is a very progressive institution. They're not aware of the wealth of the work that is being done in this area. So the interesting issue is when we decided to have the community conversation, instead of going over the usual stuff, I decided, okay, you know what, I'm just going to do a bit of profile analysis of who funds academic work, scholarly work, expert witness work on Muslims in Canada. And what I came across was Marie Curie Foundation, Metropolis Project, Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the Killam Awards, the Trudeau, the Brookings Institute, all the main funders that actually provide the structure for you to do 3 to 5 year field work, meaning you don't get the money yourself, but you can do data collection, you can do interviews, you can hire research assistants, and you can write your books. Those are now becoming quite commonplace funding structures for people in Canada doing work on Muslims. Now, what's interesting is what kind of work gets funded, and my understanding is a lot of the encouragement is for the securitization, immigration, refugee nexus work, as opposed to identity-related work. So the kind of work that is on veiling, racialization, that is on institutional forms of exclusion, those are not necessarily funded, but the ones that are related to border control, citizenship regimes, and law, admin law, they tend to be funded. Then I kind of wanted to talk about some of the, what we call the institutional geography. That is to say, what kind of institutions actually have programs whereby young people or aspiring people can go and get education on Islam, Muslim cultures, Islamic civilization, Middle East, and there's a total of 4 in the whole of Canada. How is it in other places? Well, in the United States, there's a tradition of area studies, so there are a few more, and then they're better funded. I mean, Berkeley definitely has one, UCLA has one, Harvard has one, New York has several, Chicago has one, but those are often linked with large endowment-based universities, and they often have a very rich funder that established an Islamic Studies center or for the most part, they're often related to Middle East. So in the Canadian context, you've got the UFT one, and you've got the McGill one, and you've got a small kind of conglomeration in Carleton, and then there's something emerging in Calgary, and then that's about it. And if you look at the content of the courses that are taught at these centers, they are primarily language and history courses. So you don't have anything that is concentrating on the current Muslim population in Canada and their life and times, for lack of a better word. It's all about this past glory, 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago, and most of the instructors hired are either area specialists or people who do what's called comparative area studies. So you've got specialists who look at the Hashemite dynasty, or you look at the Egyptian civilization, and most of the emphasis is on languages. So I call these, I will be probably stoned for what I'm saying, but they're kind of calcified. They're almost like Orientalist, and then So there is no space for the kind of work that's done by progressive scholars on identity, racialization, Islamophobia, possibility of change, future directions in those places. You don't even have the courses. Most of the courses that are taught in those places are about the home countries where Muslims in Canada came from. It's not about Muslims here. So what do you do then? One of the things that I had in mind in terms of having a conversation was, and when we got together prior to staging today's meeting, is the danger of ghettoization. So I started going through the names of the people who actually, for the last 20 years or so, produced 2 or more works insistently and regularly on Islam, Islamophobia, Muslim identity in the Canadian context. You see, some who are specialized in another area, out of a need or by invitation to a conversation, could produce work on this issue. But then they take off and then continue with their larger research. Others consistently keep working on this issue. So there are about maybe 30 or so. And what was interesting for me was, when you look at the faculty profile of these people, Canadian scholars who are writing, researching, and analyzing Muslim identity in Canada, in North America, there is the emergence of a small cohort of people who are not necessarily of a background which is related to Islam. And for me, this is really important. Now, there's obviously the conservative branch, which is drumming the drums in terms of fear-mongering and terrorism and all that. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about people who are committed to understanding the community and bringing the discussion about Muslims in Canada into more of the larger debate on citizenship, more of the larger debate on community politics and profiling and carding and then many of the significant issues that are related to rights and a new form of Canadian politics. There's also a body of scholarship that looks at larger critiques of culture, larger critiques of neoliberalism, larger critiques of border securitization. So it is really important that any kind of intervention coming from university somehow does not keep the conversation on Islam, on Muslims, just to that community, but situates it into a larger context. The reason being, if you don't do that, you cannot include it in the classroom. You cannot include it in the policy conversations. You cannot include it in the mainstream teachings of any given discipline. It is then kind of pushed aside as a specialty course. You can only teach it when you're discussing minority rights, or you can only teach it when you're thinking about detentions. Well, I don't want to talk about Islam and Muslims in Canada when I'm only teaching detentions, because you see what it does to that community. It basically singles out that community, a perpetual victim situation. And we know from other areas of work that, especially related to other marginalized communities and refugees in particular, this perpetual victimization, although initially it might be useful in terms of highlighting a problem-laden situation, in the long run it really deters agency. It really deters an understanding of the potential in that community. And we want to bring the discussion on the community to the mainstream as participants and as contributors to the society. So one of the things that I did was, and this is kind of towards the end, I started looking at some of the very widely circulated public documents on Islam and Muslims in Canada. So obviously you've got the usual, the census documents, but the majority of the other documents are about securitization. So there's hardly anything, for instance, let me put it this way. If you were to do work on precarious labor and temporary workers and agricultural workers, you've got actually more than what you have on the class structure and income differentials and the place in the housing market and educational profile of Muslims. So I thought, well, what a weird situation, because a lot of the public attention is on the securitization of the Muslim community. It's not about how well they're doing, what kind of access they have to education, what areas they're making a contribution. And the other issue that is really important is where does this work get published? And if you go down to the kind of academic journals publishing work on Muslims in Canada, and that's News from Scholarship, most of them are obviously progressive journals, but there's quite a few that are like Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs, Journal of Faith, Spirituality and Social Change, and Equity and Excellence in Education, Race, Ethnicity and Education. So there's always an accent on the minority identity and on race and ethnicity. Is there something wrong with that? Not on its own, except none of these are circulated and used in mainstream education. So these are kind of niche areas, and the idea is to bring this discussion to more of the core discussion. And I'm just going to give you an example from feminist political economy, for instance. Some 20 years ago, it was impossible to have a course that was on feminist political economy or feminist methodologies. And we really, really had to fight within our establishment, but also in the society at large, to make it acceptable that indeed there was a possibility of discussing mainstream economics from that angle. Now these days, it is kind of normal that you would have feminism and politics, you would have critical security studies, and it was a big game to bring those critical debates to the core. And what does it matter? I mean, you might think that a lot of this debate is going to stay at the university. It doesn't, because on average, in a given year, just this term I have 90 students, last term, depending on what you're teaching, in a given year, I am interacting anywhere between 200 to 500 young people. And I have them regularly. And it's just me. There are 3,000 of us just at York. And we're talking about 60,000 people, close to 60,000 people. That's the future. And higher education has become the norm in the Canadian society. So it's really important that these conversations actually do take place in the institution, in the classrooms, and not just as a marginal thing, not just something that concerns Muslims in Canada, but something that concerns all Canadians, that concerns the entire society. So on that note, I should probably wrap up. And yeah, thank you very much. And what we'll do is, I think, according to the format of the conversation, I've only went through things very quickly, and whichever questions you have, whichever direction you want to take to, then we'll have further debate on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nargis. So I'll introduce our second formal speaker. Aziza Kanji is Director of Programming at Noor Cultural Centre. She has her JD from University of Toronto's Faculty of Law and a Master's of Law, Islamic Law specialization from the School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London. She writes in the Toronto Star every other Thursday.
Thank you. Is this on? Thank you, Khadija. And just to give you all a bit of comfort, I probably won't speak for 20 minutes. And what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about questions. And so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to hear yours. In my short remarks, I want us to think critically about the types of questions that people are interested in asking about Muslims, because the questions that we ask predetermine the types of things that are possible to know about Muslims. They set the parameters of the discourse that we have about Muslims. And we know that the questions that we ask don't fall out of the sky. They're not naturally handed to us on a platter. They're a product of the context that we exist in, so that there are certain questions that occur to us to ask about Muslims and other questions which we only rarely or even never seem to ask about Muslims. My mom, my sister, and I do a fair bit of speaking about Muslims and Islam in a variety of different contexts. We speak at community centers, Muslim and non-Muslim. We speak to academic groups and universities. We speak at interfaith events. And in almost every single one of these contexts, no matter what aspect of Islam we're talking about, the questions that come to us from the audience are almost invariably about Islam's and Muslims' relationship with violence. We can be giving a talk on Islamophobia, we can be giving a talk on social justice traditions in Islam, we can be giving a talk on animal justice in Islam. But the questions that perpetually come to us are about, what does so-and-so verse in the Quran mean that says that Muslims have to kill infidels? Why are so many Muslims terrorists? What's the deal with ISIS? Why are so many of you so violent? These are inevitably the questions that people are interested in knowing the answers to when it comes to Islam and Muslims, no matter what it is that we are talking about Muslims. So even when we are talking about Islamophobia, the improper or irrational or unreasonable and disproportionate association of Muslims with violence, which then goes on to produce and justify and rationalize violence against Muslims, the questions people always ask are about Muslims as committers of violence, not Muslims as the victims or the sufferers or the targets of violence. Even though we know in Canada, violence that has been committed against Muslims has killed 3 times as many people as violence that has been committed by Muslims framed as terrorist violence. The Quebec mosque shooting alone killed 6 people, which, as I said, is 3 times more than the number of casualties connected with Muslims represented as terrorists in mainstream media. And so even though Islamophobia and violence against Muslims is a much more salient part of the Canadian social fabric than violence committed by Muslims, even though in Canada one is many times more likely to be attacked or injured or killed for being Muslim than to be attacked or injured or killed by a Muslim, the things that people want to know are not about Islamophobia, they want to know about Muslims as perpetrators and as sources of violence. We see this reflected also in many of the studies that have been conducted on Muslims. In her PowerPoint presentation, which she went through very quickly, so she didn't elaborate on this, but the Environics study of Muslims was mentioned. This was a study that was conducted on Muslims in Canada in 2016. It was a broad-scale study to assess Muslims' opinions on a variety of issues and then compare them to non-Muslim Canadians' attitudes and opinions on those same issues. And we see, even in the questions that Environics chose to ask to Muslims, how the association of Muslims with violence is so predominant in their thinking. So, for example, in the survey, one question that was asked to Muslims was, how do you feel about ISIS? Non-Muslim Canadians were not asked, how do you feel about your government or the US government conducting drone attacks in Yemen or Somalia or Pakistan? Non-Muslim Canadians were not asked in a similar way about the forms of violence that are conducted in their names and with their tax dollars, even though, as Canadians, we are far more responsible for those forms of violence than we are for the violence that is committed by Muslims in other parts of the world that we have nothing to do with, that we don't fund with, that we have no communication with. As Canadians, we are actually far more implicated in the forms of violence that are committed by our governments in our names, and yet these forms of violence never appear in surveys when Canadians are being asked for their opinions on things. The types of questions that might be asked, for example, are, do you think Canadian is bombing terrorists enough? Do you think we would be safer if Canada didn't dial back on its counterterrorism operations? Should we be bombing people more? Not are you civilized or uncivilized because you support the killing of civilians in the name of war. Those kinds of questions which presume a responsibility for collective violence are usually not the types of questions that are asked of Canadians. And also, as Muslims, we not only would have opinions about ISIS, we also have opinions about the types of violence that are committed against Muslims in other parts of the world, in parts of the world that we may have family in. So for example, for people might have connections to Yemen or Pakistan or other areas where funerals and wedding parties have been bombed. But these questions also were not asked on the Environics study. It was assumed that the only type of violence that Muslims were entitled to have an opinion about is violence committed by Muslim extremists. Another question on the Environics survey asked the Muslim community, have you ever seen or heard of violence being promoted in Muslim community spaces? And only something like 2% of Muslims said that they had. And yet, in another question, when Muslims were asked, do you think that violent extremism is a serious problem in the community, more than 50% of Muslims said yes. And I think this is a very powerful indication of the way that as Muslims we also internalize the dominant discourses that we are constantly being exposed to about ourselves, so that we live with what the Black American philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois called a double consciousness. We're not only seeing ourselves through our own eyes, but we are also always seeing ourselves through the eyes of others who securitize and stigmatize and surveil us, so that the representations of the Muslim community as an exceptional source of violence in Canada by media, by national security publications, was so powerful that it actually overrode Muslims' own experiences of our community, so that a majority of Muslims felt that violent extremism was a serious problem in our community, even though only 2% had ever witnessed it firsthand in our community spaces. And so this shows the power of how these dominant discourses, framed by questions which assume that Muslims are a threat and not victims of threat, also are so powerful that they not only shape the way that non-Muslims who might not have experiences with our community see us, but they shape the way that as Muslims ourselves, even though we have knowledge of our communities, we still see ourselves through the eyes of those who securitize and stigmatize us. These securitizing discourses are given a great deal of legitimacy by state publications, by national security publications, which are deeply invested in the securitization of Muslims to justify their multi-million-dollar budgets. For example, in Public Safety Canada reports, and Public Safety Canada is a conglomeration of different bodies, government bodies that have involvement in national security, and they put out annual reports on the national security threats to Canada. And even after the Quebec mosque shooting occurred, which was the most fatal act of ideology-linked violence to happen in Canada since 1989, even though the most fatal attack in Canada in, I'm not good at math, almost 30 years, was not conducted by Muslims, in fact it was conducted against Muslims, Public Safety Canada's securitizing gaze is still entirely preoccupied with the Muslim threat. And so even in reports issued after the Quebec mosque shooting, there are only 2 paragraphs in the whole report on white supremacist and right-wing extremist violence. The entire remainder of the report is devoted to Muslim threats, whether they exist in Canada or they exist internationally. They're all lumped together into one Muslim terrorist threat that's represented as being in juxtaposition to Canada. CSIS similarly has released a couple of reports since the Quebec mosque shooting, and neither mentions the Quebec mosque shooting at all as a threat to national security or public safety in Canada. One of CSIS's reports was about radicalization in Canada, how people become radicalized. And this is purporting to be a scientific study on radicalization. Now, anyone who has any familiarity with science knows that the preconditions for judging the validity of a scientific publication is that you have to know what the methodology is, and you have to also know what the control group is. That a study is meaningless unless you have a control group to compare it to. I see the economist in the back agreeing with me, so you know that this is legit. Now, this thesis study had no methodology that was disclosed. It seems like they just picked a bunch of cases of Muslims who they thought were doing something violent and then drew conclusions about what makes people violent on the basis of that. And more importantly, they didn't have any control. They didn't have any group of non-Muslims who also committed violence to compare it to. In other words, their entire framework of thinking about radicalization and terrorism was entirely, and in a way that wasn't problematized, it was entirely focused on Muslims as the threat that we have to be worried about. And so when you start from the premise that all terrorists are Muslims, in your analysis, then obviously markers of Muslimness are going to be overrepresented as signs of threat because you've already limited your analysis to people who carry the trait that you think is what makes people dangerous, i.e. Muslim identity. So this study was put out without any methodology, and it acknowledged that it didn't have any control. In other words, it should not have passed the criteria for what we think of as science, and yet it was published by CSIS, and it was picked up as something that was a legitimate study on what makes people radical, perpetuating our Muslim-centric analysis of national security, which focuses exclusively on Muslims and then uses that as a reason to perpetuate the focus on Muslims. There's also quite a great deal of funding available for these kinds of studies. Nergis mentioned the Kanishka grant, which is funded by Public Safety Canada, and many of the projects that come out of this look at marginalized communities which are seen as being sources of violence, and instead of understanding the experiences of oppression and racialization that cause protest and dissent in these communities, they look at them and think, how can we securitize these communities better? Many of the projects aren't devoted to understanding racism. Instead, they racialize communities further by taking it for granted that they're problem communities, and then asking, how can we make these communities more resilient? How can we diminish them as sources of violence, without even asking the question in the first place, how much violence actually is coming out of these communities? Does our rhetoric of stigmatization and securitization actually match the reality? It assumes the threat and then conducts studies on how to address it. And so while there's a great deal of money going into research that perpetuates the securitization of Muslims, there's very little information or analysis about the impact of these securitization measures on Muslim communities. There's a great deal of attention that's being paid to Muslims as sources of violence, but very little attention paid to the violence that Muslim communities experience at the hands of the state. For example, there's no information about how many Muslims or other members of other communities have been targeted for counter-radicalization programs, which are programs that are being developed by the state supposedly to intervene in the lives of people before they become violent extremists, but actually end up pre-criminalizing a whole host of political and religious opinions and ideologies which are wrongfully tarred as being precursors to violence. We have no information about how many people CSIS has harassed at their places of work or at their schools. The last study that was conducted on CSIS visitations was in 2004. We know CSIS is continuing to hound people and to pressure them to become informants, sometimes using very scurrilous tactics like bribing young women with makeup or bribing people with money to become informants. But we have very little empirical evidence about that. And so while Muslim communities are made to be increasingly transparent to the state so that the state thinks it has the right to know what's going on in all of our mosques and our homes and our community centers, what the state itself is doing is increasingly opaque. And I also want to add that this is even more the case for communities that lie at the intersections of multiple forms of racism. So for as little information as we have about national security practices, we may have even less about the intersection of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia and the way it manifests in police information sharing agreements with national security bodies. For example, we know that Black and Indigenous communities in Toronto are disproportionately targeted by carding, which is when police randomly stop people on the street and take a whole bunch of information on cards about them. And we know that the police is sharing this information with national security bodies under information sharing agreements, but we have absolutely zero information about what kind of information is being shared, where it goes, what are the effects on the people for whom their information is shared in that way. And so while in the ideal theory of democracy, it's supposed to be that it's people who have privacy and the state that is transparent and accountable, in the securitization discourse we have that's being perpetuated about Muslims, it's actually been flipped so that it's now the state that is opaque and that has privacy and that refuses to share information about its practices, and it's the people who are made to have no privacy and to be increasingly transparent to the state's surveilling gaze. None of this will change as long as we keep on asking the same questions about Muslims, the questions that assume that Muslims are the danger and that increasingly draconian state powers are necessary in order to fight or address or protect us all from the threat that Muslims pose. And so it's all of our responsibility to make sure that our institutions, not only academia, but also media, for example, ask better questions about Muslims, ask hard questions to the state about their practices that stigmatize and marginalize and securitize Muslims. But in order to ask better questions, we first have to have a better critical understanding of the parameters of our current knowledge. And so in order to do that, these kinds of mapping exercises of the knowledge that we currently have are essential. And now I think we'll turn it over to your questions.
Thank you, Aziza. So I think, like Aziza said, like our plan was, we're going to have a conversation with people on the floor. We have a roaming mic.
Could it be spontaneous?
Spontaneous, yeah. Well, usually
We can hear each other when we talk.
But because we're filming?
Oh, right.
for the and sorry, and I don't know if you know about by spontaneous. Usually we just like to have them a moderator pick, just because Muslims like to talk all over one another. And
That's not just an Islamophobic stereotype. It's
Okay.
So,
Do you want me to handle the mic?
Try.
oh yeah, our mic whiz, Iman. Okay, and sorry, just so that we can have this moving as quickly as possible, keep your questions short.
Aziza, I hope you are not going to interrupt me because I have to make few comments.
Okay, but keep it short, or I'll have to keep it short for you, Dr. Hayani, so.
I'm just joking, actually. Now, I just want to comment on what Aziza mentioned, which is really very...
Can you speak more to the mic? Yeah.
First of all, I want to comment on what Aziza said, by way of like the kind of questions. They always ask questions as if they are expecting certain answers, or the question itself tells what kind of mindset the questioner is in. You know, when Canada was involved in just allowing 40,000 Syrian refugees to come to Canada, Zoomer, the network, organized a kind of a debate, a forum, which was of course aired, about this, how should Canadian react to this, and so they invited me to participate in this. And to my utter surprise, I was the only one who tried first to really praise Canada, said, like, this is consistent with Canadian values. I mean, this is a country which is built by immigrants. You know, the two most important vicious attackers against Muslims who really think that Canada should not allow Syrian refugees to come to Canada are two Muslims. One of them is a woman, and the other one is a man. And if you
Let's
want,
not be afraid to name
I can
names.
mention their names if you want. I couldn't believe it.
I guess it doesn't actually matter, but
So the thing is, what I'm trying to say is that, you know, we're responsible because we allow some of us to be the spokesperson on our behalf when in fact they don't represent us at all. I remember once I wrote to the National Post, and I said, if you were to conduct a survey among Muslims in Canada and who are the worst, the top 10, the most despised Muslims in Canada, you will find the two, Tariq Fatah and Rahil Rizal. And they are the two ones who are always interviewed as if they are the spokesperson for Canadian Muslims. This with regard to you. Like, this is our fault. We allow some so-called Muslims to speak on our behalf when in fact they are the worst spokesperson for us. The other one is another question I just want to ask Professor Nergis about this. You know, in Canadian history we have something called oral history. Now, since we have around 40,000 Syrian refugees, and I think they have lots of stories to tell, is there anything within York, etc., an interest in trying to document the awful stories, some of those, or most of them, have, about the trauma, about the destruction, the killing, the massive killings, and it is really part of the Canadian narrative. And at the same time, of course, although the vast majority are Muslims, so that makes all the more relevant. So is there anything within
so sorry, just to clarify, your question was about oral histories,
yes,
related to for Syrian refugees and their
Yes.
experiences of trauma, and if such a thing exists.
and that could be kind of a continuous, like, so you take a sample and you see, how they evolve over time, which would be quite interesting. These are my two. Thank you very much.
I guess we'll go one by one. Thank you. Concerning Syrians, right now it's the initial phase of resettlement. The 40,000 just came in. In effect, today in classroom we had one of the representatives of the York Initiative in my human rights class, whereby he was outlining how they were coming in waves, and then, as you do know, this whole business started with the death of Alan Kurdi, and its very short time span. Now, Canada accepted groups of refugees before, and then there was an initiative for an oral history archive that I've also been involved in. But at the moment, for instance, I've got a project I'm just completing, which looks at parliamentary and jurisprudential debates concerning the allowance of public-private sponsorship for the Syrian family. So we're just at the very beginning of it. I hope in the long run it will become something that people pay attention to. But when we think of groups like Sri Lankans or the Vietnamese, the boat people, or groups of refugees that ran out en masse and Canada accepted, most of the time the community itself kept the archives.
And those archives are very, very essential for their collective memory because some of them actually do go back. I know that at University of Montreal, there's a group that's working. I mean, there's several groups working right now. There's a lot of government money, and by government, I mean Ministry of Education money. I don't mean the CSIS money, I don't mean the security establishment money, but more the academic funds are flowing into charting the reception of these refugee groups and their experiences. Again, what does that mean? Does that mean if I get that kind of funding, I am richer and I have more in my pocket? None of it actually comes to me per se. I don't mean me, but anyone in an academic position. It allows you to conduct the kind of things that Aziz was asking about, going out into the field, interviewing people with your own questions, collecting this data, processing this data, and publishing it. So it's just at the initial stages of that, and hopefully there'll be more of it. And what I was saying was at University of Montreal, a group started something very interesting, because you know that a lot of the town Syrians left. They don't exist anymore. So it's called the right of return, what is it, trajectories of right of return. So what this group is doing is, as Syrians come in, they show them a map. Let's say you're from Damascus. They show them a map, and then they say, okay, on this map, it doesn't exist anymore, but what neighborhood you were from? Where did you have houses? And then people on an imaginary map locate themselves. So the idea is that because the city no longer exists, many of those cities no longer exist, at least they kind of have a genealogy of where they've been expelled from. So it's a big, long question though.
So Dr. Ibrahim, I think it's important for us to appreciate that all systems of racism create opportunities for some of the group who is targeted by that form of racism to benefit by being what in other contexts have been called native informants or comprador intellectuals. So when it comes to Islamophobia, Muslims who profit off of their internal position in the Muslim community, or by representing themselves as people with specialized knowledge of the Muslim community because they are Muslim, to use that position to advance themselves by reinforcing the dominant racist narratives about Muslims, which is what we see with people like Tariq Fatah or Rahil Raza or Irshad Manji or Ayan Hirsi Ali. There's a whole series of Muslim native informants who have cachet precisely because they represent themselves as simultaneously being insiders of the Muslim community with specialized knowledge, who can then lend legitimacy to the Islamophobic criticisms that are leveled against the Muslim community. And I think that this dynamic exists in all communities that are experiencing racism. We see some of these conversations happening in other communities that are subject to racism, and the conversations they have about who should be allowed to speak on their behalf, who should be allowed to advocate on their behalf, are people more invested in their own egos and position by reinforcing racism and advancing their own position at the expense of the rest of the community. And this, of course, is why then they get picked up by mainstream media, because it allows mainstream media to state that they are fulfilling their mandate of representation, while at the same time not really challenging the underlying narratives that represent marginalized communities in ways that perpetuate their oppression. When Muslims have come together and protested, we have been able to make some changes in that. So for example, when it comes to Tariq Fatah, there was quite a bit of outrage over his persistent pattern of making libelous accusations against members of the Muslim community in his columns. And when people complained, eventually many media sources were forced to drop him. But the problem is we're usually not that well organized, and the problems run far deeper than just the presence of Tariq Fatah or Rahil Raza. They're symptoms of the problem, and they exacerbate the problem, but we're not really going to change Islamophobic narratives as long as, for example, people who work for CSIS or people who used to work for CSIS continue to be treated by media as neutral experts on terrorism rather than people who are deeply invested in perpetuating Islamophobic narratives about Muslims in order to justify national security agendas. Something else that your question brings up, though, is you talked about being on a talk show and talking about whether we should accept Syrian refugees or not. So much of the way that Muslims are talked about in public discourse reinforces the idea that our basic rights should be up to public referendum. So we'll have surveys asking not only whether Canadians should accept Syrian refugees and whether these refugees are a security threat. We've also had surveys asking whether Omar Khadr should have been given compensation for his torture, even though under our Canadian Constitution, the government was, and under international law, the government was obliged to give Omar Khadr compensation. And yet this was a question that was put in a survey as if it was a matter for public opinion to decide whether or not he should have received compensation. You have survey questions asking whether women should be able to wear niqabs or hijabs, as if that's not a right that's in the Canadian Charter and is something that should be subject to public opinion. And so, because we have a discourse on Muslims which doesn't take it for granted that Muslims have the same rights as everyone else is supposed to have in this country. Many communities are not in fact guaranteed those rights, but at least theoretically, it's supposed to be well established that people have the right to be free from torture, right? Omar Khadr was tortured, that people have rights to religious freedom, that Canada respects its obligations under the Convention on Refugees. And yet these very basic rights are constant because it's not taken for granted that Muslims are deserving members of the political community who are entitled to these rights. They're constantly being put up for referendum, and then this is reflected in the types of questions that people think it's appropriate to ask on surveys, which then is also what allows individuals like Tariq Fatah and Rahil Raza to have such a deleterious effect on the debate, because it's not already established for people in Canada that Muslims are fully human. And so when Tariq Fatah and Rahil Raza make their claims about Muslims, it lands on audiences that are willing to believe them.
Can I just add something?
I want to go back to something that Aziza highlighted. The embryonic surveys is heavily problem laden, but then there are other ones. Statistics Canada questions. There's just a recent one that I kind of supervised, which was the Think for Action's Calgary group. If you look at the questions, some of the questions of this most recent one is, do you trust your Muslim neighbor? As if they just arrived last week. Now this is the third generation. This is the third generation. So there is this issue either as if Muslims never existed in Canada and they just all of a sudden kind of appeared the last 10 years, they became visible, or if I was not from the Canadian context and I looked at these questions, I would honestly think that they were kind of en masse settled the last 5 to 10 years. That they didn't have any history, that their children didn't grow up here. So there is something about endemic, the problematic about the perception of where these communities are. Now the question is whether this is a systemic issue, whether, let's say, other communities, Hindu communities, other marginal communities are subject to the same invisibility, visibility. You're not there for 30 years and all of a sudden something happens that in the global scene and you become questionable for your even presence and then your trustworthiness. There's a whole literature and whole debate on who is deemed trustworthy and on what ground. So those are very, very important entry points for future work.
Thanks, Nuri. So I think we do want to try to get in quite a few questions. So let's go, Metwali. You have a...
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khairan, Sister Aziza, because this is the same name for my sister in Egypt. And thank you very much, Doctor. The opportunity I want to talk about, or the point I want to talk about, we are not perfect. Everyone has his mistakes. And before we blame the other people from what they are doing to us or against us, we have to evaluate ourselves and criticize ourselves to see how much we understand our religion. Subhanallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala قال ويل للمصلين. Oh, to those who are prayer, because they are not following the rules of God, the rules of Islam, as a prayers or as worshippers. That's why we have to criticize ourselves. So, for example, Trump, before what he did, why Bin Laden did what he did first? If we care about what happened in Quebec, and 100% wrong, why we don't care about ISIS or Sisi in Egypt, what he's doing in Muslim against Muslim people under the Islam identity? That's why we have to evaluate ourselves first. We have to criticize ourselves to understand Islam as perfect as it should be before we blame others for what they are doing against us. The other question for Doctor, I read so many, I had even conversation with Mr. David Zimmer about these 3 or 4 bills that needs to be changed because it is against the human rights of the Canadians or human rights of human people. For example, Bill C-31 against refugees. If refugee came and had been accepted as a refugee and it happened later on to visit his country, his rights will be diminished. His rights will be cancelled. He will not be Canadian anymore. Under which rules in this kind of legislation is not right. It is against my rights as a human right, as a human being. Because if he came as exactly as I came from Chicago as a refugee here. If something happened and I visit America, I have no right to enter Canada as a refugee and everything will be diminished. Never ever happened anywhere else. The other thing for the bills, bill for example 43, C-43, Canada abortion. There is right for any abortion in Canada. It is very normal and it is against even the human rights of the little babies. How come we have a right to kill somebody even if he was before we were born?
Sorry, Brother Metwali, I think I can understand that you have a particular position on abortion, but that isn't one that is shared by all, and that it is also a right for women to choose what they do with their bodies. So I don't just want to accept that as a normative statement that abortion is necessarily wrong. That's not a position that we have here, so I want to clarify that and ask you not to elaborate on that.
Okay, then forget about abortion. The other one, euthanasia. We call it euthanasia. Not killing the little baby, but killing the elders. If anyone who is very old and
Brother Metwali, I just want to clarify the position for us here, which is that once again people have the right of what to do with their bodies, even if it is something that we wouldn't choose for ourselves. And so I think, and that's fine, so I think you shared some of your thoughts, and specifically about the lack of right for refugees to go back to the countries that they were refugees from and still retain their refugee status here in Canada, as well as Muslims need to criticize themselves. Did you want the panelists to respond to that, or else we can just keep on taking more questions? And I think Narda is very eager to have a lot of community participation. So why don't we take a couple more comments, and then we can get and I'll keep a note of them, and then we can hear back from the speakers if that's something. So thank you.
Okay. The last one, C-51, Doctor. C-51, Bill C-51.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Dr. Qasim Farah, and I graduated from York University, and I'm Imam of a masjid. So here I would suggest 3 recommendations that I would like you to put into your suggestions and whatever your recommendations are. And the first one is that I would say maybe about to make a link between refugees and Muslims. And can you recommend the government to give a special consideration to anyone who was religiously persecuted, a Muslim person who came to here and sought asylum and left because of the religious persecution? Because most of the Muslims who came here, and we know in one way or another, they had like I say, those who have educational background, majority of them may got some kind of religious persecution based on their cults or sects or cleric influences, something like that. And I'm insider and I know many cases. That's one. The second is that Muslim representation in Canada. As we see now, we have like one man and one woman representing all the Muslims here. Why don't we advocate for the media and the government to recruit or to attract many Muslim scholars who were taken because of their background, educational background, their credentials, their level of education, and which must be a moderate Muslim who can go along with the new civilization. And the third one is what the brother just mentioned. We have to evaluate ourselves as Muslims, because what I observed is that most of the Muslim institutions in Toronto, as far as I know, are represented by individuals who may not be the right people to lead that institutions because of their education. And that's why we see many young radicals coming up, because what happens is that most of us, maybe we don't pay full attention to the Quran. We pay attention to Sunnah and some other traditional matters. Those traditional narrations may not be, can be far from Islam even. And for example, the issue of honor killing, apostasy, and infidelism, all those things. Like right now, I can narrate to you 500 to 400 to 500 verses from the Quran that prohibits to kill or insult or banish anyone who left Islam. They can accept Islam today, in the morning, and in the afternoon they can go back, they can refer to any other religion, and there's no problem. But we have this case which says they must be this death penalty.
Sorry,
So,
can I ask you though? Because to my knowledge,
Yeah.
people aren't being killed in Canada because they're converting out of Islam.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also important that we be specific
Yeah.
about the problems we're facing as a Muslim community here, because we know that one of the ways that Islamophobia works
Yeah.
is that it just conflates all of the different situations of Muslims all over the world, and then that's projected onto Muslim communities where those dynamics might not actually be prevalent. So the problem of honor killings, for example, we know that it's pervasive in other societies, and that where it is pervasive, it's in Muslim as well as non-Muslim communities. In Canada, so-called honor killings are extremely rare. There have been maybe 12 in the last 10 years, many of them not in Muslim communities, and yet Muslim communities in the public imagination, as well as now in law with the Zero Tolerance for Agricultural Practices Act, are indelibly linked with, Muslims are linked to honor killings, even though that's not actually a fair representation of what's going on.
Yes, so that's one example, but there are many other issues which are like that. And take like right now, I think most of us are happy to say, oh, we are making progress because we have so many halal meats, where we never think about which one should be halal, the meat or the money that we are buying with the meat. So, and like that, we have something which are more theoretical, but not in fact from the Quran. That's what I have realized. And now we can take advantage of the new change which is taking place in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman, who is making a lot of progress. He declared that most of what we are learning now, say the Wahhabism, was introduced to the Muslims in 1979, just recently. So then we have to get Muslims who advocate, who introduce non-Muslims to Muslims and show the real meaning of Islam, which is based on peace and security and stability. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you, Imam. So I think we'll try to take another comment and then we can go back
I'm going to
to
handle
this.
it.
Sorry?
I'm going to handle the mic and pass it on.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for everyone who shared their questions. I guess my question or comment is around the mapping of Muslim histories in what we call Canada. So in terms of like things that are accessible, if you just Google Muslim histories on this land, a lot of it starts in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, and a lot of it begins with narratives of like European converts who are coming to this land, and presumably, at least, I mean, I would assume that there's a lot of Muslim history that comes before that that's just not documented. In particular, what I find that a lot of these histories leave out are Black Muslim narratives, and I'm curious as to what kind of work is being done, or if you know of like archival sources and things where we can access those sort of histories and sort of stitch together the making of Muslim identities here.
I'm going to go backwards.
Do you want me to repeat some of the questions?
I have some notes, but let me have a look. I remember the Bills 51. Prior to that, what have we got? Yeah, and then we've got
Bill 31 as well.
Yeah, and then we've got the Islamic practices, and then the Muslim history one.
When Bill C-51, you mean the Anti-Terrorism Act 2015?
I think that's what he means. That's what he means, I think. Now, I'm going to try to answer that, but not in terms of the content of that bill, because that bill is very poisonous. There's no doubt about that. However, what you're asking as a question is a very common pro forma practice in refugee law. The idea is that when you come, escaping life-threatening circumstances and immediate threat, and then if you do get refugee status, you're given a document that protects you as long as you do not go back to your country of origin until you get citizenship. But there is more to it in the sense that, let's say, you and I are dual citizens. If by choice, even though I may not be a refugee, I might just be an ordinary dual citizen, if I go back to my country of origin and something happens between me and my state over there, my citizenship over there trumps my citizenship in Canada. So these are very standard international law practices. So in that sense, there isn't much we can do about that. That's just the way it works. However, the content of Bill C-51 and other ones, that's a different matter. Those are problem laden. And that applies, incidentally, more so to the Tamil population or mixed Kurdish populations than other populations who are primarily Muslim. So, I mean, this is just a call to the community. It's important to build alliances and to build parallels. So some of the suffering that is shouldered by the Muslim communities, newcomer recent communities are also being subjected to similar profiling, similar securitization and exclusion. And these are state practices, right? So the bills that you're mentioning, the field of influence for those are not necessarily Muslim communities, they're actually other communities. That goes back to the long list employed by CSIS for the longest time that has the terrorist organizations. And half of them are not Muslim, or actually more than half of them are not Muslim organizations. So it's important to realize that there are alliances to be built with other communities in terms of targeting these state practices. In terms of the scholars and then, you know, who leads these communities, I'd like to concur with Aziza in the sense that one of the problems is that that is natural that we bring our homeland and our memories and our practices here. At least I would say in my case, some of us have unfinished business over there, politically and otherwise. So those are important. But if they all feed into this mishmash of a Muslim identity in Canada, then I have young students in classroom who say, do all Muslims engage in female genital mutilation? I mean, it just becomes so crazily surreal in the sense that a community, a diaspora that has 55 different nationalities and God knows how many languages, ethnicities, all becomes this one thing. And in that sense, maybe it's indeed important to at least strategically pay attention to some of the issues here rather than relating to the world of Islam elsewhere or at large all the time. That's a very important normative foundation, but in terms of politically engaging with the Canadian public, I think it's important to keep the issue here.
I completely agree that Muslim communities need to understand the problems that we face internally. But in order to begin to look at ourselves and change the situation in ourselves, before Allah changes our situation, as we read in the Quran, in order to change our situation, we have to understand it properly. We have to understand the causes, and we have to understand the context. Part of the problem with the way that the issues in Muslim communities are understood is that they are analyzed within Orientalist modes of understanding, which, as Professor Edward Said told us, one of the tropes of Orientalism is that it understands all of the issues and all of the things that are happening in Muslim communities through the lens of religion or through the lens of theology. And so then Muslim communities are represented as unchanging and perpetually mired in backwards Islamic thinking, rather than looking at the contemporary political and social forces that are producing the problems that we are confronting. So, for example, the representations of the Iran-Saudi conflict that are propagated in mainstream media represent it in an Orientalist way, saying that it's the product of a 1400-year-old Sunni-Shia conflict. If this is the way we understand that conflict, as the product of theological divisions that go back 1400 years between Sunnis and Shias, there's no way that we can address it because we've misdiagnosed what the problem is. Similarly, when we look at the situation in Egypt, if we see this as the product of some inherent essentialist Muslim predisposition for dictatorship and authoritarianism, instead of looking at the factors that have led to the development of the deep militaristic state in Egypt, including the forces of pre-colonialism, colonialism, and post-colonialism that have produced the political context within which Sisi is able to enact so much abuse, unless we understand those forces, we'll never be able to address the problem. If we constantly rely on theological explanations for problems that are political and social in origin, we have no hope of changing our situation. And this is why we need to be able to understand and deconstruct Islamophobia, because it is Islamophobic Orientalist ideas that produce these misdiagnoses of our situations by attributing our problems to Islam or misinterpretations of Islam rather than to political and social forces which we can change and which we have control over. We see these types of misdiagnoses of the Muslim situation in our Canadian Muslim communities as well. So as you rightly say, we have deep problems in many of our Muslim institutions with leadership and with scholarship and with organization, with representation of women in the leadership in these institutions, with representations of expertise. We have very real problems in our institutions, but to listen to the state's discourse on Muslims, you would think that our main problem in our Muslim communities isn't any of these things, that it's radicalization, even though the state never tells us statistically or empirically how many people they think have, how many Muslims they think have radicalized in Canada, what the actual volume of the threat is. And yet, when we internalize these narratives that the problem with the Muslim community is radicalization, we end up devoting our resources to countering radicalization, so that now we see mosques and community centers and community leaders being drawn into countering violent extremism projects, adding to their already burdensome workloads to now become people who are supposed to be counseling Muslims who we don't even know if they're on the road to violent extremism, because the state hasn't told us what their proof is for saying that having a certain political belief or having a certain religious belief means you're going to go join ISIS or try and blow something up in Toronto. There's no actual empirical science behind what the state is saying makes people radicalized. And yet, because we're being told this constantly by very authoritative sources, we internalize it, and then we have imams and other community leaders being drawn into tasks which they're not equipped for, which they're not trained for. They're supposed to be now engaging in counter-radicalization on the basis of a very flimsy empirical foundation. And this is distracting us then from addressing the real problems that we face in our community. And in addition, as a Muslim woman, I know it's very difficult to begin to talk about patriarchy in our communities in a context of Islamophobia when we know that any critiques of our communities are liable to be abused by Islamophobes like Tariq Fatah or Irshad Manji or Rahil Raza in order to represent the entire Muslim community as pathologically misogynistic and violent, and to justify laws like the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which actually ends up harming the Muslim women who it claims to be saving. But as a Muslim woman who is concerned about both Islamophobia and patriarchy, both within Muslim and non-Muslim spaces, it becomes very hard to talk about these kinds of things in our community in an Islamophobic context. And so that's why it's not adequate to say, well, we have to stop blaming others. We just have to look at ourselves and fix the problem in ourselves, because I don't think we can adequately understand or address the problems in our community as long as we're working in a context of pervasive Islamophobia. And then I want to address this point about the types of histories we tell about Muslims in Canada, because I actually think it's extremely important. The way that we talk about Muslim histories shows how we try and prove our belonging on this land by referring to settler histories, right? By integrating Muslims into the project of settling indigenous lands, shows how we're not really engaged in a systemic critique of racism in Canada. Racism in Canada is built on a foundation of the genocide of Indigenous peoples, and we can't truly address racism as long as we're just trying to integrate Muslims into that racial structure instead of really challenging it. We know that there was enslavement of Black people in Canada. Many of the people who were enslaved came from West Africa, and so it's likely that many were Muslims. And the fact that we don't tell those histories shows the limits of the way we conceptualize anti-Islamophobia. I know Sheikh Abdul Hakim Quick, I think, is doing some research on this, and I think maybe Afua Cooper might also be doing it, but there's a real dearth of information on this, and I think, again, that that's a symptom of a broader problem, which is that for us, we see the project of Muslim liberation as being integration into white supremacy rather than really challenging it. And so again, when we're talking about looking at ourselves and changing ourselves, why is it that we think the things that we need to change are things like honor killing and oppressive apostasy laws, and not also Muslims' complicity in settler colonialism? I think that's something that we need to talk about changing as Muslims.
Sorry, I'll just mention that Noor, the CZ created a reading list on Islamophobia that may be of use to people who are interested in understanding the way that, for example, Islamophobia intersects with settler colonialism and anti-Black racism, and there's copies of it available over there. So not exactly on your question, but a way that brings together these related forces.
There are a whole host of themes that come through when you're talking that I think that we need to have more of these discussions, but in very critical ways in the themes: patriarchy, settler colonialism, etc. But I wonder for the next few minutes if we can take some of the questions, and then maybe even talk to each other about them and see where we go. So
okay, for sure.
Because I know there are a couple of them.
Well, because we want to wrap up in 13 minutes,
That's right.
My name is Ahmed, and I moved to North America about 40 years ago.
Can you speak more to the mic?
Okay. My name is Ahmed, and I moved to North America about 40 years ago. We were talking about evaluation. What I can say that when I was here about 40 years ago, and I was very proud and welcomed as a Muslim in North America anywhere I went. I'll give you two recent examples, which is connected to my question. My brother-in-law had to sell a property in USA, and in that neighborhood, his property was not sold for 2 years because it was a home belonging to a Muslim. The second question, the second incident I would narrate, which is related to my question, that the real estate agent in Canada was driving a white couple to show her the property in Durham region. While they were talking to each other, the lady was driving, the real estate agent was driving towards to show the home. In the middle of conversation, the couple said, "I hope you're not taking us to a Muslim neighborhood." So she was a little perplexed, and then after about a little thought, she said, "I am a Muslim." The real estate agent said, "I am the Muslim." So you can imagine how much embarrassment was caused to that couple. My question is, why Muslims? We see in this audience, we have a blend in attire with the Western world. And then we go out in some areas in Canada or in the suburbs or in the mosque, we have a different attire. The question is what are we doing to blend in so that people, the people who are here, they feel comfortable with us. What MSA is doing, nobody knows. I know. If you ask me privately, I will tell you what the MSA is doing with our youth. The Imam over here said evaluation. How long? For 1400 years we are telling, oh, we have to follow the Sunnah and Quran. We have to follow the Sunnah and Quran. 1400 years. Why it is not happening? The question is why.
So sorry, so we want to take a bunch of different comments, and I think Nadia, what you're hoping for, especially is that now we'll have mostly the audience talking. So I think we generally understand your point, which is asking about why won't Muslims blend in?
No, so we have to do some evaluation ourselves, that why even after 1400 years there was a carnage of Muslim in Bosnia. Let me finish it. Then why after 100 years of settlement in Rohingya, you see the Muslims communities, the carnage is there, and the bodies are lying like a sardines. I've got the pictures I can show you. Why after 110 years, what I read correctly, the Muslim moved to Burma, and this carnage took place after 110 years. The question is why?
They've actually been there for much longer. The Rohingya community is actually indigenous to...
So?
The Muslim community is actually indigenous to Rakhine State. They've been there for much longer than 100 years.
For how long? Can you tell me?
For many generations.
It's about what I read, it was about the first Muslim entered Burma about 100
and that's the current state of Burma, but those people were living in that area.
Okay.
But I think...
So for example, when the British did surveys of Rakhine State in the 1800s, they listed Rohingya as an ethnicity group. And this idea that the Rohingya are just a recent implantation there or a recent presence is actually a Burmese Islamophobic narrative that's used to delegitimize their presence there.
So let me finish my question.
Okay, can you try to make it
Let me
brief?
finish my question, just one sentence. What if the same thing happened after 100 years in Canada? Over.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and sorry, and I just want to quickly, before we move on, to just suggest that we not blame people for the persecution that they're experiencing, whether it's Rohingya or Bosnians or people of Bosnia. And I don't think it's from what you're saying, that kind of sounds like the tone of your comment, and I would just warn against that because I think that is unacceptable to be doing. So, please, sister.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I just wanted to thank you for raising some important issues. I think we ought to question the Orientalist underlines and underpinnings of why we frame issues in our community as primarily being due to honor killings, forced veiling, FGM, and a whole host of other issues when we don't want to discuss our complicity and instrumentalization, however undesirable we are to the Canadian state and the national mythology that continues to decimate, dispossess, and invisibilize Indigenous communities here in Canada. Secondly, also, there's been a lot of talk tonight about self-reflection or as a whole in our community and what it means to be a moderate Muslim. And I think oftentimes that's just a euphemism for a more insidious dichotomy of good versus bad Muslims. And again, I don't think we should be playing into that. But my question really is, although I don't believe the onus is on Muslims to shoulder the burden of proving ourselves to be worthy of humanity and consideration, but I do wonder, how can we begin to unravel this messy business of suspectness embodied in our community by the state?
So how do we be less suspicious?
No, as in like when suspectness is embodied, so I think the way this state, or at least national surveillance strategies or projects, it's like suspectness is embodied in communities, right? Like that's their unit of measure. Although I don't believe the onus is on us, I don't even know how to begin to even start to talk about or I guess begin to challenge or how to unravel all of that. I mean, it's huge, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are some of the steps we can take? Again, not saying that the burden is on us to kind of challenge it to a degree. Yeah.
So we have one more question and then you can respond. How's that? I don't want to.
I think Josh also has a question.
I think we should go this way.
Of course, I agree with Aziza. How could you argue with her?
I know that's not what you've always thought, so.
I'm thinking of differently, that you talked about radicalization in the community. So I guess the question is, how could we prevent, what could we do about that? Because there are people who are radicalized and going to doing terrible things. The other thing, I think it came out from this discussion, is that there's a conflict between Sharia law and civil law. And how do we live in this society where?
What specific conflicts do you see? Can you elaborate a bit?
Well, I mean, it came out from the discussion that if you follow the Sharia law, like you shouldn't have abortion, that kind of thing. And then yet we have a civil law, which, well, we don't even have a law. We have no law. It doesn't prevent, and in fact, I don't know whether many people know the history that I was really, how should I say, amazed and impressed that, what was doctor's name? Dr. Yeah, he decided to do.
Sorry, I just get scared when I hear you say the word history, which makes it sound like this is going to be quite a long thing.
No.
We actually only have 5 more minutes.
Okay, okay. What I mean is that in spite of the law, that the society decided that this was not to be, and it was that way. So what I'm saying, this is a civil law, civil society. We decide together what to do versus what does the text tells us. So how do we solve that problem?
Okay, then let's get Sasha's comments and then they can do their final.
Thanks. So it's really short. I think the conversations tonight, the thought of, the burden of transforming the narratives into something positive, and I'm reminded of, the youth that are growing up with this kind of dialogue and this discourse and this
the challenge of what media is doing to them and their identities. And I think for me, what I'm taking from the conversation is to highlight the positive stories. And I'm reminded by some of the dinners that I attend, where we sit around on the floor and we just have conversations about Islam and the narratives and the teachings. And I think within the generation that's growing up in this climate, it's so important to also keep in mind what we're doing to them in terms of the dialogue and what they're learning. So I think amidst all of this, from the state, from global narratives around what a Muslim identity is, I think it's still important to keep in mind that there's youngsters around that are also listening and what we're saying. So that's what I took away from conversations tonight.
Thank you.
I'll just touch upon a few of the comments, partially because I'm not privy to all the information that would answer your questions, and partially because we're wrapping up. The business of suspectedness, I'll give you two examples that would be counter strategy. One is when we were advocating, defending, writing on administrative detention of Muslim suspects. For about 5 years, we kept pushing for these proceedings to be brought under proper criminal law. So that basically totally bypassed this whole business of the Muslim terrorist profile. You see what I'm trying to say? So we were trying to pull it in, and we point blank were asking, by we I mean myself and a number of other colleagues, why on earth would you create a special category of suspects who are immune from having any access to any standard criminal justice proceedings that are privy to evidence threshold and all that? Okay, so this is one strategy whereby you point blank say this is actually a very abnormal practice, and then there are no grounds for this to be institutionalized and constituted as a specific way of approaching a community. The other one is in the area of education. There's enormous amount of work that's coming out, especially out of Quebec. Very progressive colleagues. These are on the ground as well as in the institutions, pushing for spaces to be created for children of Muslim communities, despite the very, very heavy-handed Islamophobia in Quebec. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to institutionalize certain measures so that children of Muslim families could actually practice their faith and feel comfortable in their skin and normalize. By normalization, I don't mean forced integration. I don't mean becoming the good Muslims. It's basically the right to exist. And they push for it, and they refer to charter rights and constitutional rights for the protections. So, I mean, this is standard technique in human rights or any other rights struggle. You hit the state or you hit this establishment with the very promises that it makes to the society, then it doesn't keep. In terms of, what was it now? Gosh, oh, the Sharia law business. That debate got killed very suddenly and in the most unpleasant terms, in the sense that not only hit the Muslim communities that were reaching out for arbitration in their family law, it also affected Catholic communities and Orthodox Jewish communities and other communities. And we do know from examples as extreme as England, it is possible in certain areas of law to resort to arbitration. There's nothing against civil law, and then there's like a fairly strict framework that allows you to keep your constitutional rights, but have a choice in terms of communal or personal practices in the area of marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance, and others. And then there are mixed models. So I think we do a disservice when we put these as kind of polar opposites, because there are systems where they do exist. And even, I mean, our colleague, what's the brother from Egypt? I mean, most of the Middle Eastern countries have combined legal systems anyhow.
When we're thinking about the relationship between Sharia and Western legal systems like civil law or common law, I think it's really important to start with understanding what we mean by Sharia. Often, when we think about Sharia from a Western-centric conceptualization of law, which is as a set of rules that's been written down in a book, then we look at rules which we think are in Sharia and we compare them to rules in Western law and we say, oh, these are incompatible and so Sharia has no place in a Western society. But I think that this is a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about what Sharia is. We know from pre-modern Muslim societies, before the imposition of the modern structure of the nation state with colonial processes, which propagated a monistic view of law as a singular code that's issued by a state, a book of rules, that this is very far from the way that Sharia functioned in pre-modern Muslim societies. There, it was a pluralistic discourse. We know that at one point there were hundreds of schools of Muslim law that developed. It was separate from state power, so jurists were independent of the state, and people would go to jurists for opinions and they would reason on the basis of the logic of their school and the sources that they applied in order to come to a decision. And so there was actually a plurality of opinions that was encompassed within what we now think of as being Sharia law, and they were all equally respected by the state. Which is why, to me, it doesn't make sense really to talk about Muslims adhering to the Sunnah or to Islam that's been, propagated 1400 years ago, because the very point is that Muslims have always had disagreement and a plurality of opinions about what it means to live Islamically, and that's been reflected in Islamic law. And so I think often the conversations we have now about the relationship between Sharia and the Western nation state assume a Western model of law which is really inadequate for understanding Sharia. So if we understand Sharia not as a rigid book of codes, which, for example, doesn't allow people to have abortions, and in fact I think it's fallacious to say that that's incompatible with civil law, because civil law allows someone to have an abortion. It doesn't require them to have an abortion. And so you can live according to Sharia and decide not to have an abortion for yourself and still not be in violation of civil law, right? The civil law is a permission, it's not an obligation. But even deeper than that, when we think about Sharia as a process of reasoning for what it means to live in accordance with God's will in a particular societal context, and when we understand that the aspects of Sharia that are now thought to be most incompatible with Western law, like criminal punishments, which are thought to be harsh, were applied in a very different context, right? So they weren't applied by a state that had the power of a modern police force to go and investigate crimes and winkle out anyone who they thought was doing something bad. It was applied using very high standards of evidence, and it was applied according to the prophetic hadith, which said if there is any shred of doubt in the case, you cannot apply the punishment, so that if people retracted confessions, even right before the point of punishment, the punishment was not applied. So the way that Sharia was functioning was in a very different context from the way that the modern nation state applies law. And so I think it's wrong to just say that Sharia and Western law are incompatible, because you're talking about applying them in two completely different contexts and using two completely different state apparatuses. But if instead we think about Sharia as a pluralistic legal discourse that draws inspiration from the Quran and the Hadith and the other sources of law, that it's a process of legal reasoning, then I think we can understand how Muslims can live in accordance with Sharia in ways that aren't necessarily incompatible with the other legal systems that we're subjected to. And I also want to point out that in Canada, we often think that the only legal system that's important for us to abide by is Canadian state law. We forget that we are also subject to the treaties with Indigenous peoples that are what allow settlers to be on this land with any kind of legitimacy in this first place. And so when we're thinking about the different types of legal relationships that we're bound by, we also have to be careful not to fall into the trap of falling into a Canadian state-centric model of what that is, and instead understand that there have always been plural legal structures operating on this land, that it's not just that of the Canadian state. When it comes to contesting the suspectedness of Muslim bodies, I think we know what doesn't work. We know that blending in and assimilation doesn't work, because Muslims who have tried the hardest to assimilate themselves to the state's national security agenda, Muslims who have served on the national security advisory bodies that help to cast suspicion on Muslims, even they have not been immune to the gaze of suspicion of the state. Even they have come under surveillance, no matter how hard they try to assimilate themselves into the agenda of the state. And so even when we talk about, when we say, well, people bring suspicion on themselves because they're wearing non-Western clothing, why should non-Western clothing be considered inherently suspicious or incompatible with what we think of as being Canadian? We know in some models of radicalization propagated by the NYPD, for example, growing a beard and wearing a thobe is represented as a sign of radicalization. And instead of saying, well, then Muslims shouldn't grow beards and wear thobes, we instead need to ask, why is the state so invested in representing certain markers of Muslimness as being dangerous, even though they have no obvious or proven correlation with violence? In fact, we know from the United States that markers of violence are more likely to be being, a white man, since they've been the ones who have been responsible for the majority of mass shootings, than having a beard and wearing a thobe. And so the very fact that that Muslim dress is seen as suspicious, again, is a sign of a deeper problem. And the way to address it isn't by saying we accept its logic and then we regulate our behavior accordingly. Instead, we need to ask, why is it necessary to represent Muslims as threats, even though we're not actually responsible for the majority of the violence? And so this gets to the underlying logic of the national security state, which requires Muslims to be represented as suspect. And so trying to assimilate won't work, because it's not, Muslims aren't represented as suspicious by the state because we're inherently suspicious. We're represented by suspicious because the state needs to represent a threat in order to justify its national security project. We know in the decade after 9/11, an extra $91 billion was spent on counterterrorism by the state that it wouldn't have spent otherwise. And how else could they justify that except by saying, look, all these Muslims are running around and they're going to blow up your via rail trains and attack Canadian buildings, and so we need to spend this money in order to rationalize this spending. The problem doesn't start with Muslims. The problem starts with the need to represent Muslims as suspicious. And so another thing that doesn't work, which we know Muslims have also tried, is to say, well, then we should just represent right-wing extremism, white supremacist violence as terrorism too. Because what ends up happening is that it just lends greater legitimacy to the laws and structures of surveillance that actually then end up being applied more against Muslims. So we know in the wake of the Quebec mosque shooting, for example, Donald Trump used that as an opportunity to say, see, this shows why we need extreme national security measures like my Muslim ban. And so we know that anything that expands the apparatus of the national security state ends up being disproportionately applied against Muslim populations. And so we need to understand the way that national security arises from the white supremacy of the state. It actually, often as Muslims, we think that national security became racist after 9/11 and we attack it, or we contest it on that basis. But actually the roots of racist national security run far deeper in Canada and have a much longer history. The RCMP, for example, was started as the Northwest Mounted Police, which was a police body that was formed in order to expel Indigenous people from their land, to clear them from the plains. And we know that many of the pre-9/11 exercises in militaristic counterterrorism, where you had military force being applied against protesters, those were actually, it was Indigenous people who were protesting the theft and seizure of their land and resources who were subjected to those. And then after 9/11, Muslims became the primary justificatory image to rationalize these national security practices, but actually it's rooted much deeper in the settler colonial structures of the state. And so to really contest that, we have to stop accepting the basic legitimacy of the national security project and because often we act as if national security is only incidentally racist, right? That it's just accidental that it's being, or it's just circumstantial that it's being disproportionately applied to Muslims. Whereas if you look at the history of national security, it's inherently racist, and it's always been racist. It's always been about representing certain populations as inherently suspicious in order to justify pre-criminalization and surveillance of them. And so in the long run, I think you can't, to get to your question, you can't dismantle the suspectedness of Muslim bodies unless we get to the roots of the way that settler colonialism depends on representing racialized bodies as suspicious and as threats to the nation, which means that we have to work on building Muslim indigenous solidarity in the way that we approach these things. In an immediate term, I think it's essential that we mobilize against Bill C-59, which is supposed to be the Liberals' correction of Bill C-51, which is an extremely draconian counterterrorism law, but actually, and the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group has excellent analyses of Bill C-51 on their website. I'm not going to take up time going through all of it, but suffice it to say, it represents itself as fixing Bill C-51, but it actually ends up normalizing its practices of surveillance and preemptive suspicion. Even in the guise of fixing it. And so it's essential that at every stage we push back against the normalization of national security logic, and starting with Bill C-59 is important.
Okay, so I think we will wrap up there. We wanted to finish at 9, but it wouldn't be a Muslim event if we didn't finish at least 15 minutes late. So I think we're on time, Muslim time-wise. So with that, of course, we know the conversation is incomplete, but thank you to York University to hosting one of the, or for bringing forward one of these conversations. And I don't know if you wanted to say a few closing words or.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you, Nergis and Aziza, for providing us with a lot of food for thought, and to the audience for raising critical questions. My one takeaway with this is for us to think about how these truths then, what do we do with it? Because you've focused a lot on victimhood, right, within Muslim, among Muslims. And we know for particular populations, black populations, indigenous populations, all the mental health issues that arise. I want to know then, what is the narrative around identity for young women, for children, for grandchildren? What is their identity? How is their identity being shaped by all of the narratives around being Muslim? So I think that's something to continue with. But I'm not gonna go anymore. And thank you, Samira, for hosting, for allowing this to happen, and thanks to the audience.
Are there any other upcoming CC?
Yes. I mentioned we just had one, but they're in progress. We're in discussion.
TBD.
Yes.
Is there a mailing list for lab, or just?
Yes. On the website, if you go to York University website and you just type in community conversations, you'll get the link to the conversations. Okay? So thank you so much. Thanks to both of you.